So welcome to the 10-minute tutorial series, a series of, clue is in the title, 10-minute tutorials on the A-level French Revolution course. Doesn't matter whether you are doing AQA, an Excel or OCR, this is the series of mini tutorials for you. Very important, go to myhistorytutor.com, website there. You can get yourself a copy of the A-level textbook that accompanies this series. So what we talk about in the tutorials, we expand in great depth in the book. So make sure you go there. All right, let's get started with the lesson. So we're going to look at the Enlightenment. What was it? You've probably heard of the word, the phrase, but you may be a little bit unsure as to exactly what it was. We're going to look at the major Enlightenment figures, the big intellectual heavyweights. Then we're going to look at how perhaps other people might have been influenced by the so-called Grub Street pamphleteers that we mentioned in the first lesson. And also we're going to have a look at something of profoundly important significance, the American War of Independence, and how it shaped attitudes in France in the run-up to the revolution, their own revolution. Right, a little bit of context here, because again, just to refresh from the first lesson, the importance of getting your head around this tension inside of France between, I suppose, what you would call kind of absolutists and constitutionalists, I suppose you might call them. So the absolutists were those that believed that the king really should have unchallenged authority in France. So we see here this picture. This is Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who built Versailles. Louis XVI's great-great-great-grandfather, who was really in his pomp at the end of the 1600s, early 1700s. And he is alleged to have said "L'état c'est moi," which translates as "the state, it is me," i.e., basically everything comes through me. I make the rules, nobody else does. So there is this tension between those that believe that the king should really be able to rule without any constraints or any checks. And the other side of it is the constitutionalists who are effectively saying, no, the king must be constrained. And the Parliament, as we shall see, were very firmly in that camp that the king could not just do what he wanted. There had to be constraints on the monarch's power. If we look at France as a country, it's basically pretty backward. It's backward in terms of its religious beliefs. It's backward in terms of what it believes the right of the monarch to be. And it's backward in other areas, not just economics that we touched on in lesson 1, but it's also backward in terms of its medical thinking. And a good way to understand what the Enlightenment was, you have to sort of consider what these great Enlightenment thinkers were rebelling against. And if you understand that, it sort of explains what the Enlightenment was. So, for example, if we look at point 1 there, religion, what the Enlightenment thinkers were doing was saying, well, you can't just accept what you're told, which is, of course, fundamental to religious teaching. Don't just accept what you're told. Work it out for yourself. Does it make any sense? If it doesn't make any sense, then it's probably not true. And also, if we look at the monarchy, it's a pretty daft way of running a country, just simply to select the next in line, next in terms of bloodline, becomes the absolute ruler of a country. Surely a much better way of doing it is to elect somebody or to pick somebody that is most suitably qualified for the job. Just because you happen to be the son of the previous ruler doesn't mean you're going to do a good job. It doesn't really make sense to have the rule of the country based on simply bloodline as opposed to talent. And if we look at things like medicine, um, disease was still in the 1700s largely explained. Mass diseases like plague or leprosy, things like that, were tended to be explained by the fury and the wrath of God for a sinful population. Um, and again, the Enlightenment really was a challenge, a rejection to that, and saying, no, no, this is just nonsense. What we have to do is think about this logically. If something is true if it is proven by facts to be true. So the context of the day is that intellectually they were very, very backward in how they thought. Too often there was a culture across Europe of accepting what you were told rather than challenging it. And that's what the Enlightenment really was all about. It was challenging accepted dogma to say, no, no, I'm not accepting that. I'm only going to accept it if you can prove it beyond any reasonable doubt that it's correct. A little bit more context also, literacy rates at this time, particularly amongst the nobility, were going up and up and up. And there was an explosion in the publishing industry. There were a lot of books in the 18th century got published compared to previous centuries, and people started to read. And of course, that's potentially dangerous if you're an absolute monarch, because they might read ideas that are pushing a different narrative, i.e., maybe there should be a constitution, not an absolute monarch. And that's what we find from the Enlightenment. They start, these Enlightenment thinkers that we're going to look at in just a moment, start pushing this narrative out that an absolute monarchy is a daft idea. And because people could read, and they could read the new books that were being published, they were beginning to absorb those ideas. Okay, so what was the Enlightenment then? Well, first and foremost, it's an intellectual movement, roughly speaking, middle of the 17th century through to the early 1800s. Okay, so when we say an intellectual movement, it's a movement of ideas, and it's put forward by a number of leading intellectuals, sometimes called philosophes in France, leading academics who write books, novels, plays, pamphlets, essays. And all of what it's focused on is challenging the accepted wisdom, the accepted ways of working, and saying, no, no, this is a daft way of working. There are better ways to do it. So it was a profoundly optimistic movement, and it focused on things like the governance of countries, as well as other areas such as poverty and disease. But it was profoundly optimistic. At its heart, Enlightenment thinkers believed that they could make the world a better place. All you had to do was just to focus, think logically, use rational thought, and by doing that, you could make the world a better place. And as mentioned there, one of the ways you can be logical is to appoint somebody based on talent to run the country or run a region of the country, not just because they bought their office through the venality of offices, or that they are the king, the absolute ruler, because they were the son of the previous king. Um, it builds on the ideas of the scientific revolution, which was just a little bit before, which principally focused on physics and maths. And the scientific revolution sought to try and explain the world, or the scientific world, through the use of logic and analysis. Similarly, the Enlightenment tries to explain the world around it in terms of governance and how a country works, again, through logic and analysis. Basically, use your brain, don't just accept what you're told. Understandably, the Enlightenment thinkers were a massive threat to the absolute monarchs of the mid 17th, mid 18th century. Many of them had to flee their countries when they wrote their various pamphlets and books, and many of those books were censored because they were an obvious threat to these absolute rulers. They were also a massive threat to religion because they were effectively undermining religious uh, teaching. Um, and they were a particular threat to the Catholic religion, which we'll cover in just a moment, but they effectively undermined the idea that the Catholic faith should have exclusivity in France. But it's not hard to see how, even without knowing anything about these heavyweight philosophers, how they would be a threat to Louis, particularly when you had enlightened monarchs in Prussia and Austria at exactly the same time as Louis in France. The enlightened monarchs, as I mentioned in lesson one, of Joseph II Austria, Frederick the Great in Prussia, trying to do some good in their country, trying to improve the quality of life for their people. France was seen as somewhat backward, somewhat unenlightened, shall we say. So, who were these philosophers, these big intellectual heavy hitters? Well, we're going to look at four. John Locke, English guy. Voltaire, French. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Swiss, but lived most of his life in France. And then Charles Montesquieu. He was also French. You are going to need to know who these people were, what their core ideas were, and how they impacted on both the French Revolution, but also indirectly through the American Revolution. Okay, you will need to know each of these four. Luckily, we're going to look at them. So first up was John Locke. Now John Locke was writing quite a long time, about a century before the French Revolution. So you could argue, well, if he's writing so long before the French Revolution, then he obviously didn't have much impact, because why did it take 100 years for the French Revolution to kick in? Well, that is actually a perfectly fair point. And if you are asked to comment on the impact or the importance of the Enlightenment, you absolutely should point out that Locke was writing. His great work, the two treatises on government, was published in 1690. Okay, that's 100 years before the French Revolution. So you're perfectly entitled to make the argument that surely he couldn't be that influential. Otherwise, the revolution in France would have broken out sooner. However, so let's look at what arguments Locke was putting forward in this essay. So the key thing with John Locke is he argued that people have natural rights. Okay, this was a pretty revolutionary stuff and actually got him in trouble, so he had to leave England. And those were three things: life, liberty, and the ownership of property. Okay, and the second point he was talking about is sovereignty. Sovereignty is if you like, the right to govern. Okay, sovereignty lies with the people. Okay, so that means that the power flows upwards. So what Locke was saying was that the people give their power to elected representatives in order to represent their best interests. Okay, specifically the maintenance of these three key natural rights. Okay, people, ordinary people, give their power, allocate their power to elected representatives in order to protect these three fundamental things. And crucially, what Locke said is that if the elected representatives or the monarch, whatever the system of government you have, if they do not act to protect these 3 points, life, liberty, and the ownership of property, then the people have the perfect right to overthrow whoever is that representative, whether it's a government or a monarch. Okay, so that was pretty radical stuff and got him in trouble. So that's why, as I said, he had to leave the country. He also writes another essay about religion. And in that essay, he makes the point that religion should not be fundamental to the state. Okay, so what he meant by that was, um, in Britain at the time, or rather England as it was then at the time, the Protestants were very much in the ascendancy, and Protestants were, you know, to a limited extent persecuting Catholics for their faith. And of course, we just had 120, 130 years of the kind of religious roller coaster where Catholics and Protestants were vying for power and persecuting each other depending on who was in power. And Locke came along and said, look, it's completely daft to persecute somebody on the basis of what their religion is. Because if one person is a Catholic and another person is a Protestant, the fact that they practice the Catholic religion does not negatively impact on anybody else. So you should not persecute somebody on the basis of whatever they do, their religious belief, just because it happens to be different from, you know, the prevailing majority. You only persecute people if they do something wrong that negatively impacts on other people. So in essence, he was preaching for religious tolerance. So this is a potential threat to the French Catholic Church, which had been the state, the official state religion, that had actively promoted the persecution of Protestants and Jews and other people in order to try and maintain their dominant position. But Locke came along and said, no, no, no. Everybody should be entitled to practice whatever religious faith they like in the open without fear of persecution. Okay, so that religious argument was an important one, but perhaps the two more important ones are really that people have the right to overthrow any government or ruler that failed to protect their natural rights. But also the concept of an absolute monarchy was completely incompatible with his new conception of sovereignty. Remember, power flows upwards for John Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers. This is completely at odds with the divine right of kings, where power flows downwards. It comes from God into the king, to his ministers, and then it eventually reaches the people who have to do what they're told. Okay, that's completely different to how the Enlightenment thinkers saw it. So another key Enlightenment thinker was a guy called Voltaire. That wasn't actually his name, but he was known universally as, I think, under his nom de plume, his sort of playwright name as Voltaire. He was a poet, playwright, author, wrote many novels, also wrote many essays. Was a huge fan of John Locke, was writing a good few years after Locke died, but he took Locke's ideas and he brought them to France. So he helped to spread Locke's ideas across France. And Locke, and Voltaire's main contribution was he was fiercely opposed to the censorship of the Bourbon, successive Bourbon regimes. Okay, the Bourbons were the name of the French royal family. So he was fiercely opposed to that. As a playwright, you might expect him to be, advocating essentially freedom of speech and freedom of the press. You should be able to write and say whatever you like, even if you don't, people don't like what you write. You should be free to say it without fear of being censored or attacked. He was also against torture, which was quite commonplace at this time, but also he viciously attacked the Catholic Church. Bigotry. So bigotry is really the idea that just a refusal to consider anybody else's point of view. So if you're a religious bigot, you basically refuse to consider any other religious denomination, whether it's Muslim, Judaism, or another branch of Christianity, typically Protestantism. And he attacked all aspects of the Ancien regime across his plays, his novels, and his essays. And he was probably the most famous of the Enlightenment thinkers. He was a real celebrity, although he too had to leave France to avoid getting locked up. Although he was actually locked up, but only briefly. Now we come to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau writes a very famous book, extended essay called The Social Contract in 1762. The key bit you need to know about that is he creates the idea of the general will. Okay, what he means by the general will is that you're almost doing away with a king. You don't need a king. You're almost doing away with a government. And the policies that will be implemented are really just implemented by administrators that do what the majority of the people want. Okay, so he believes in a sort of concept of direct democracy where everybody is involved in the day-to-day making of policy. It doesn't really work for a country of 28 million people. It might work for a relatively small town, and he knew that, but he still advocated this idea of the general will. So um, you can see straight away that Rousseau's work, which was quoted extensively in the French Revolution, the phrase of the general will was quoted particularly by Robespierre. You can see immediately how this is a threat to Louis's regime, any of the previous Louis, because when he was writing the social contract in 1762, it was actually Louis XV who was on the throne. But it's not hard to work out that what he's saying is a major threat to any absolute monarch, because what he's saying is, what's the point of a king? If policy is simply going to be implemented by what is the general will of the vast majority of the population, i.e., what they want to happen, you don't need a king. You barely need a government. You just need administrators who are going to implement that general will. So he was a hugely influential figure in the revolution. Lastly, we're going to look at this guy, Charles Montesquieu. So Montesquieu's great contribution was what's called the separation of powers. And you see this now in pretty much every governmental structure, particularly the most famous one was particularly America, where you have three branches of government. The executive, they are typically headed by a president or prime minister. So in Britain, we have a prime minister and a cabinet. That's the executive. They are the ones that propose laws. A legislature, the legislature vote on the laws that the executive typically promotes, but the legislature can also make their own laws as well. And finally, you have a judiciary. Okay, that's the judges basically, and what they do is they are obviously they adjudicate on whether individuals break the law, but also they act on whether the government has broken the law, and they can block government policy if it's believed that it's breaking existing domestic or international law. So most famously in America, the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, will occasionally block legislation or actions that companies or individual states will try to do because they say it's against the constitution or it's against the existing laws. But the point that Montesquieu was making is that under an absolute monarch, there are none of these checks and balances on each other's power. Everything is vested in the hands of one man. So there's no way of stopping him if he wants to do something completely daft. What Montesquieu was saying, he said, look, you should have three different branches of the government, and each one can, in their way, block the other one so that no one branch of government can become too powerful. The legislature can block the executive by simply refusing to vote in favour of the legislation the executive wants to pass, and the judiciary can oversee both the legislature and the executive and block any legislation that they are trying to pass as well if it's deemed as being illegal. So that was Montesquieu's contribution. We see his ideas coming through when the revolution begins to blossom in 1789 through 1791. So why does this matter? Well, the Enlightenment, the ideas of the Enlightenment, these philosophers, these four men, there were others, but these are the sort of the four key ones. Because what they do is they're really undermining every aspect of the Ancien regime. Um, as I say, it's profoundly optimistic, and what they're doing is they're rejecting the mindset that people had traditionally. Well, that's how God intends society to be. There's an elite at the top, and there's the rest of us at the bottom. Some of us suffering a miserable life. And the Enlightenment thinkers come along and say, no, that's just daft. It doesn't have to be like that. We can make the world a better place. So what they're hugely influential is they shift the narrative in people's heads that actually, you can change it. Okay, you can make the world a better place. We don't have to have an absolute monarch. We can have a better way of governing. You don't have to have Catholics or Protestants being persecuted. We can do it better than that, provided we base the building of society on not on tradition but on common sense and logical analysis. Okay, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. As ever, like, subscribe, add your comments below. And don't forget to go to myhistorytutor.com, get yourself a copy of the book. Robespierre was a huge fan of it, and understandably so. Next lesson, don't forget to get that notification. Lesson 7 is going to be on the American War of Independence and the so-called Grub Street pamphleteers and how they both influenced revolutionary France. So it just follows on from today's lessons. Today's lesson is really a two-parter, lesson 6, lesson 7. See you soon.